The helicopter spun through the blizzard metal, screaming against wind that had no mercy. Sparks exploded from the cockpit in bursts of orange and white, each one a countdown to something final. Diana Westfield gripped the seat with both hands, blood streaming down her temple in a warm trail that contradicted the ice forming on the shattered window beside her face. The world tilted at angles that defied physics, gravity pulling in directions it shouldn't, and through the chaos she found her voice. "Leave me." The words tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "The pilot's gone. There's no one left to save." Through the fractured glass, a figure appeared in the snow. Broad-shouldered, moving with purpose through drifts that would have stopped anyone else. Ethan Ward, no. Marcus Reed didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't do the rational thing and run the other direction. He tore through wreckage that was already trying to become a coffin, smoke filling his lungs with poison flames licking at his jacket sleeve like they wanted to know him better. "I'm not going anywhere." His voice carried the kind of certainty that only comes from having lost everything once before. He pulled her from the burning frame, wrapped his body around hers as the fuel tank caught with a sound like thunder being born. The explosion lit up the mountainside, heat and light consuming everything in a radius that would make the evening news. White light swallowed the world whole, turned snow to steam metal to shrapnel, and two people into a single desperate gamble against physics and fire. Metal shrieked its death song. The snow turned the color of sunsets and warning signs. Then silence dropped like a curtain, complete and absolute, broken only by wind that had already moved on to its next victim. 2 days earlier, Seattle woke under frost that made the whole city look like it belonged in a snow globe. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway of a wooden house that had seen better decades, watching his daughter zip up a coat that was getting too small. The house sat on the edge of Pine Ridge, a town that existed because someone had needed a place to put an air traffic control station and figured people might want to live nearby. Wrong on the second count, mostly right on the first. Emma was 8 years old with blonde hair that tangled no matter how carefully he brushed it, and eyes that belonged to someone who wasn't here anymore. She held a model helicopter in hands, still small enough to make Marcus's chest hurt when he thought about how fast time moved. "Did you really fly this high, Dad?" She tilted the toy toward the ceiling, toward the sky, beyond it, toward altitudes that used to mean something different to him. Marcus smiled but kept his eyes honest. "Once. Now I just fly in memory." The drive to school happened in an old pickup that rattled over icy roads like it was trying to shake itself apart from shame. The radio played classic rock because that's what the previous owner had left it tuned to, and Marcus had never bothered changing it. Emma hummed along to songs written before she was born, her breath fogging the window in patches she'd draw shapes in with one finger. At the school gate, she turned back with a question that stabbed him in all the old wounds. "You'll pick me up, right?" Marcus nodded. "Always." He worked as a radar technician at Pine Ridge Air Traffic Control, a job that kept him grounded in every sense that mattered. The station perched on a hill overlooking a valley that tourists thought was pretty and locals thought was home. Inside walls lined with monitors tracked flights across the northern corridor, each one a blinking dot representing people who trusted that someone was watching, that systems worked, that shortcuts hadn't been taken in the name of quarterly profits. Marcus's desk lived in organized chaos, coffee mugs from 3 different days-old flight logs. He should have followed technical manuals he'd memorized but kept nearby like security blankets. On the corner sat a framed photograph that he looked at exactly once every morning and never again until the next day. Him, Emma as a baby, and a woman with dark hair, and a smile that could make you believe the world was kinder than it actually was. Claire, dead 10 years. He didn't talk about her to his coworkers, didn't bring her up with Emma, unless Emma asked. First, didn't even talk to himself about her most days. But she lived in every decision he made, every late-night shift he volunteered for, every time he walked past the hangar where helicopters sat like sleeping predators and felt his hands start to shake. Flying had been his life once. He'd been one of the best rescue pilots in the Pacific Northwest, trained to navigate storms that grounded everyone else, the guy they called when the situation was already impossible and needed someone stupid enough to try anyway. Stupid or skilled, the line had always been thinner than people wanted to admit. But that was before. Before the crash, before the loss, before everything changed in the amount of time it takes for a navigation system to fail and a helicopter to forget which way is up. His supervisor leaned into the break room that afternoon, coffee in hand, gossip on his tongue. "Word you hear about tomorrow, Westfield Aviation's doing a test flight. Big demo for the press, their new X9 model." Marcus's hand froze on his coffee cup. The ceramic felt suddenly fragile, like it might shatter from the tension in his grip alone. "Westfield?" The supervisor nodded, oblivious to the way the temperature in the room had just dropped 10 degrees from Marcus's perspective. "Yeah, CEO's flying with the pilot herself. Gutsy move if you ask me. Nothing like putting your life where your marketing is." Marcus said nothing. He stared at steam rising from his mug, watched it dissipate into air that suddenly felt harder to breathe. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. The name Westfield hadn't crossed his path in years. He'd made sure of it, buried it deep, built his life in a town small enough that corporate aviation news didn't usually penetrate. But hearing it now brought everything back in a flood that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with drowning anyway. The anger, the grief, the betrayal that tasted like copper and broken promises. That evening, he signed up for the overnight shift, told his supervisor the radar had been glitching and he wanted to monitor it personally, make sure nothing went sideways when it mattered. The lie came easy because it was wrapped in enough truth to pass inspection. He did want to monitor something, just not the radar. After Emma was asleep, after he checked her room twice to make sure she was breathing steady and safe, Marcus went down to the basement. His workshop, his obsession, his penance. The space was lined with schematics of navigation systems, crash reports, spanning a decade, technical documents that weren't exactly classified, but weren't exactly public either. Everything cross-referenced, color-coded, annotated in handwriting that had grown tighter and angrier over the years. In the center of the largest wall hung a diagram of the Westfield Dynamics H-47 navigation system, red circles marking every point of failure, every corner cut, every warning ignored. Marcus had spent 10 years on this. 10 years researching what had killed his wife, building a case that lawyers had dismissed and regulators had buried, and the court of public opinion had never heard. He taught himself engineering principles he'd never needed as a pilot, learned to read technical specifications like they were flight charts, understood failure analysis better than some of the people who wrote the reports, and he'd done more than research. In the corner of the workshop, covered with a tarp that had kept it hidden from Emma's curious eyes, sat his prototype, a navigation system he'd designed from scratch, built from components he'd bought with money that should have gone to Emma's college fund. It worked. He'd tested it 100 times in simulations. But simulations weren't certification, and certification required money he didn't have, and connections he'd burned, and a willingness to play politics with people who'd proven they valued stock prices over human lives. An old box sat on the workbench, cardboard, soft with age and handling. Inside were legal documents from the lawsuit he'd filed against Westfield Dynamics, dismissed on technical grounds that translated to, "We have better lawyers than you have evidence." FAA reports marked inconclusive in bureaucratic language that meant, "We investigated ourselves and found no wrongdoing." Newspaper clippings about the crash, each one shorter than the last, as the news cycle moved on and the world forgot that Claire Reed had ever existed. Marcus pulled out a photograph from the bottom of the box. Claire in her flight suit standing in front of a medical transport helicopter. She'd been an ER nurse, had loved flying because it meant getting to patients faster, saving lives that might be lost in the time it took an ambulance to navigate mountain roads. She was smiling in the photo, making a peace sign with one hand, her other arm around a colleague whose name Marcus had forgotten. He touched the photograph with fingers that had learned to be gentle with things that could never be replaced. "I'm close, Claire. Almost there." The TV in the corner of the workshop murmured background noise, some news channel he'd left on more for company than information. But then a phrase cut through his concentration like an alarm. "Westfield Aviation to demonstrate new X9 helicopter tomorrow in what company officials are calling a revolutionary step forward in navigation technology." Marcus looked up. The screen showed a gleaming helicopter in a hangar, all sharp angles and corporate confidence. A woman in an expensive coat stood beside it, talking to reporters with the kind of poise that came from never having to doubt yourself because life had never given you a reason to. His jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. He made a decision that he'd probably been making since the moment his supervisor mentioned Westfield's name. "I'll be at the tower. I need to see this. Dawn came to Seattle gray and cold, the kind of morning that made optimists reconsider their life choices. Diana Westfield stood in the hangar at Westfield Aviation Headquarters, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a major corporate demonstration. Engineers ran final checks with clipboards and tablets, investors clustered in groups, discussing stock implications, reporters set up cameras at angles approved by the PR team. Diana was 32 years old and looked like someone who'd never failed at anything worth mentioning. Her coat was tailored perfectly, her dark hair pulled back in a style that said professional without trying too hard, her posture the kind that came from knowing every eye in the room periodically checked to see what she was doing. She inspected the X-9 helicopter with an attention to detail that would have made her father proud if her father had still been alive to be proud. The X-9 represented 2 years of development, millions in investment, and the culmination of Jonathan Westfield's vision before a heart attack had taken him at 63. Diana had been 30 when she'd buried her father, 30, when she'd stood at his funeral and promised herself she'd continue his legacy, prove she was worthy of the name that came with expectations in trust funds, in the weight of a company built on the idea that good engineering saved lives. Tom Chen, her lead engineer, approached with the careful body language of someone about to suggest something the boss wouldn't like. "Miss Westfield, you don't have to do this. We can send Jake up solo. That's what test pilots are for." Diana shook her head, the decision already made days ago despite everyone's efforts to change her mind. "If I'm asking people to trust this machine with their lives, I need to trust it with mine first. That's not negotiable." And she had been part of the design team for the X-9's navigation system, had personally overseen improvements to the framework her father had pioneered. The board of directors had made it clear that this demonstration needed to succeed. Stock prices had been trending, down competitors were gaining ground, and investors wanted proof that Westfield Aviation still led the industry in innovation and safety. No pressure, just her entire professional legacy riding on a test flight. Diana climbed into the co-pilot seat with movements practiced enough to look natural. Jake Martinez, their senior test pilot, gave her a thumbs up from the pilot's position. His easy confidence should have been reassuring. Should have been. The rotors began to spin, building speed until the sound became less mechanical and more elemental, like wind deciding to have opinions. The helicopter lifted off the ground, smooth as a promise, rising into the gray Seattle morning, while cameras recorded every second for the live stream that would prove to the world that Westfield Aviation still had what it took. At Pine Ridge Tower, Marcus watched the radar screen with the intensity of someone waiting for a disaster he couldn't prevent, but also couldn't look away from. The X-9 signal appeared as a blinking dot climbing steadily into the mountains that separated Seattle from the northern valleys. Clean flight path, strong signal, everything by the book. For 20 minutes it stayed that way. 20 minutes of normalcy that felt like mockery. 20 minutes Marcus spent running calculations in his head, comparing this flight to another one 10 years ago, looking for patterns that only someone who'd studied every detail of the previous failure would recognize. Then the dot flickered. Red warnings flashed across his monitor. Marcus leaned forward, pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with exercise and everything to do with recognition. He'd seen this before. He'd watched this exact pattern of degradation in Claire's flight data, spent months analyzing it, knew it, like a song he wished he could forget. Tower to Westfield X-9. Do you copy? Static answered, the kind that meant systems were failing faster than backup protocols could compensate. Westfield X-9 respond. Your signal is degrading. More static, then Jake's voice breaking through, distorted and tight with controlled panic. Tower, we've lost navigation, instruments are going haywire. The signal vanished. One moment, a blinking dot representing 2 human lives and millions of dollars in technology. The next moment, empty screen space and an alarm that Marcus silenced with one hand while reaching for his jacket with the other. He didn't think about Emma waiting for pickup after school. He didn't think about protocol or chain of command or the fact that he was a radar technician, not a rescue pilot, not anymore, not for 10 years. He ran to his truck and drove into the storm that had been building over the mountains, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The snow was blinding, the kind that turned windshield wipers into a suggestion rather than a solution. Marcus's headlights cut weak tunnels through white that kept filling back in behind him. He followed coordinates burned into his memory from the radar, his hands gripping the wheel hard enough to make his knuckles pale. his jaw set in a line that would have warned anyone who knew him that rational thought had left the building. When he saw the wreckage, something in his chest cracked open. The helicopter was on its side like a dying animal. Rotors bent at angles that would have been impossible during any kind of controlled descent, smoke pouring from the engine in black columns that the wind tried to disperse but couldn't quite manage. Flames crept along the fuselage with patient hunger. He could see Jake through the cockpit, neck-bent, wrong body, still the kind of still that didn't need medical training to interpret. But through the cracked window on the other side, he saw movement. A woman slumped against her harness, blood on her face catching light from the flames, eyes half open, and trying to focus on the world outside her current nightmare. Marcus ran toward the wreckage like he was 25 again, like his body hadn't learned fear yet, like the last 10 years of playing it safe and staying grounded had been practiced for exactly this moment. The heat hit him first, then smoke that made his eyes water and his lungs protest. He shielded his face with his arm and pushed forward through physics that wanted him to stop. Through the shattered cockpit window, he saw her clearly now. She looked at him, and for a moment, neither of them moved, two people separated by glass and circumstance, and a decision that needed to be made faster than thought. Then she screamed, "Leave me! The pilot's gone. There's no one left to save." Marcus didn't answer. Words took time he didn't have. He tore at the door with hands that had forgotten how to be gentle, found enough leverage to rip it open, unclipped her harness with fingers that moved from muscle memory older than his fear. He dragged her out of the seat just as the fuel tank decided it had waited long enough. The explosion threw them both into the snow with force that would leave bruises in places they wouldn't discover for days. Marcus covered her body with that felt heat roll over them like a physical thing, like summer concentrated into one breath that wanted to consume instead of comfort. When the initial blast wave passed, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than Claire had been, or maybe he was stronger from desperation, and carried her into the tree line. His lungs burned. His hands were numb from cold and heat in alternating waves that couldn't decide which would win. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The cabin was close, had always been close, one of those places he kept maintained, because some part of him had known that someday he'd need a refuge that wasn't home. The cabin was small, wedged between two hills, and surrounded by evergreens that had watched too many winters to be impressed by one more. Marcus kicked the door open, lock broken from the last time he'd forgotten his keys, and laid Diana on the couch near the fireplace. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine in situations where the field was on fire and the medicine was improvised. She was breathing, but it was shallow. Her skin was cold enough to worry about. He cleaned the blood from her forehead with hands steadier than he felt, bandaged the gash above her eyebrow with supplies from a first aid kit he kept stocked because paranoia and preparation looked the same from the outside. Checked her ribs for breaks with careful pressure that made her wince even unconscious. She didn't wake up. He built a fire, made coffee more from habit than need, tried to process what he'd just done. Saved someone. Saved a stranger. Run into danger instead of away from it for the first time since Claire died, and his hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, shaking so badly he had to set down the coffee mug before it became another thing he broke today. Marcus sat in a chair across from her, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, and tried to ignore the questions piling up. Who was she? Why had she been co-piloting? What had possessed Westfield Aviation to test a flight in conditions that any competent meteorologist would have flagged as dangerous? The fire crackled. Outside, the storm howled like it was personally offended by his rescue. Diana slept or was unconscious. The distinction mattered medically, but not practically. Not right now. Marcus stood, walked to the window, looked out at snow that would make rescue attempts impossible until morning at the earliest. The wreckage was out there somewhere, buried under white that fell too fast to measure. And with it, answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Around midnight, Emma appeared in the doorway like a ghost with bedhead and concern. She was supposed to be asleep in the back room where Marcus had left her with a book and a flashlight after Mrs. Chen had brought her by, unable to keep her overnight because of the storm, figuring the cabin was closer than town anyway. "Dad, who's that?" Marcus exhaled slowly, measuring his response the way he measured everything when it came to Emma. "Someone who got lost. Go back to bed, sweetheart." But Emma didn't move. She had her mother's stubbornness along with her eyes. She walked over to the couch, looked down at Diana with the unfiltered curiosity of 8 years old, tilted her head like she was solving a puzzle. She looks like an angel who fell asleep. Marcus's throat tightened. Maybe she is. Emma disappeared and returned with another blanket from her room, the one with stars and moons that she'd picked out herself 3 Christmases ago. She tucked it around Diana's shoulders with a gentleness that made Marcus's chest ache, then climbed into his lap and fell asleep like the world wasn't complicated. Marcus held his daughter with one arm, kept his eyes on the woman breathing softly by the fire, and wondered what he'd just done. What chain of events he'd just set in motion, whether saving one life could possibly balance against losing another, or if that kind of cosmic accounting even existed outside of desperate people trying to make sense of randomness. Victoria woke to wood smoke and coffee. Her head throbbed in rhythms that matched her heartbeat. Her ribs ached when she breathed deep enough to notice. She opened her eyes to rough wooden beams, a stone fireplace radiating heat, and a man sitting across from her with a coffee mug and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. He was maybe 40, graying brown hair that needed a cut, a scar along his jaw that looked old enough to have a story, and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in situations where comfort was optional and survival was negotiable. "Where am I?" Her voice came out scratched like she'd been screaming. Maybe she had been. "Safe. Storm's too thick to call anyone tonight. I'll get you help in the morning." Diana tried to sit up. Pain lanced through her ribs sharp enough to make her gasp and fall back. The world tilted sideways for a moment before steadying into something approaching horizontal. "Who are you?" Marcus took a sip of coffee, buying time with the gesture. "Just someone who was in the right place." Diana looked around. The cabin was modest in the way that meant its owner either couldn't afford better or didn't care to impress. Weathered furniture that was clean, but old maps pinned to walls for reasons she couldn't guess, a framed photograph of a man, a little girl, and a woman who wasn't there anymore. The absence in the photo felt deliberate, like a memorial disguised as decoration. "You saved my life." It wasn't a question, but Marcus didn't answer anyway. He handed her a glass of water instead, watched while she drank with hands that shook enough to make the water ripple. "The pilot, Jake, is he?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Diana's face crumpled, grief hitting her in waves she tried to control and failed. Marcus looked away, giving her what privacy the situation allowed. His gaze directed out the window at snow that kept falling like it had a quota to meet. Outside, through the thick curtain of white, a pair of headlights moved slowly along the ridge. Someone was searching, but not for survivors. Marcus watched the lights with narrowed eyes, tracking their pattern, noting that they stopped in places where survivors wouldn't logically be, but evidence might. In the morning, the storm had passed with the suddenness of Pacific Northwest weather, leaving behind blue sky and snow that looked innocent under sunshine. A search and rescue team arrived at dawn following coordinates Marcus had radioed in once the storm had cleared enough for communication. They loaded Diana onto a stretcher with efficiency that spoke of too much practice, wrapped her in thermal blankets that crinkled with every movement, escorted her to a waiting helicopter that was definitely not Westfield Aviation. Marcus stayed behind, standing in the doorway of his cabin, watching the helicopter disappear into gray sky that was clearing by the minute. Emma tugged his sleeve with a question in her eyes. "Is she going to be okay?" Marcus nodded, hoping it was true. "I think so." Inside, the TV was still on from last night. Emma sat on the floor eating cereal, her attention caught by the screen in the way of children who could focus intensely on things adults learned to filter out. The news anchor's voice filled the room with practiced concern. Breaking news. Diana Westfield, CEO of Westfield Aviation, has survived a catastrophic helicopter crash in the northern mountains. Authorities are calling it a miracle. Marcus froze. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, hit the floor, shattered into pieces that scattered across wood he'd have to sweep later. Emma looked up with alarm, but Marcus wasn't listening. He was staring at the screen as the camera cut to footage of Diana being carried on a stretcher, her face pale but alive, her identity suddenly very clear and very important. The anchor continued with the kind of background detail that news producers loved. "Miss Westfield is the daughter of the late James Westfield, founder of Westfield Dynamics, whose helicopters revolutionized emergency transport in the early 2000s. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Westfield, not just the company, but the family, the daughter of the man who'd killed his wife. Emma's voice came from far away. "Dad, But Marcus wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was 10 years in the past, standing beside another crash site holding Claire's body, while his world ended in a radius measured in yards and years. 10 years ago, Marcus Reed had been a rescue pilot, the best in his unit if the commendations collecting dust in a box somewhere meant anything. He'd flown into hurricanes when meteorologists said, stay grounded, into wildfires when the smoke was thick enough to navigate by instrument alone, into situations that turned mountains into graveyards and needed someone either brave or stupid enough to try anyway. Then on a cold November night, he'd lost the only life that mattered. His wife, Sarah, no Claire, had been aboard a medical transport helicopter, a Westfield Dynamics H-47 model, when it went down over the northern ridge. The report had said mechanical failure, navigation error, no survivors. Clinical language that didn't capture the sound Marcus had made when they'd told him didn't describe the empty space Claire left behind that no amount of time seemed to fill. Ethan Marcus had flown the search himself, against protocol, against advice, against his own better judgment. He'd found the wreckage. He'd found her body. And in the weeks that followed, while his daughter learned what mommies in heaven meant, and he learned what functioning on autopilot felt like, he'd found something else. Proof, documentation. Evidence that the navigation system in that helicopter had a known defect. A defect that Westfield Dynamics had identified, studied, and decided was acceptable risk, because fixing it would mean recalls and lawsuits and quarterly earnings reports that disappointed shareholders. James Westfield himself had signed off on the safety reports, his signature right there in permanent ink, making permanent decisions about other people's lives. Marcus had tried to go public, had contacted lawyers who'd looked at his evidence and his bank account and made calculations about which mattered more, had filed lawsuits that Westfield's legal team buried under motions and delays and technicalities that added up to, we have more money than you have justice. The FAA had investigated with the enthusiasm of a regulatory body that knew which side employed the investigators after they retired. Case closed. Move on. Nothing to see here. So Marcus, broken and furious, and drowning in grief that tasted like failure, had walked away from flying, had sworn never to touch another helicopter, never to let another Westfield machine take someone he loved. He'd kept that promise for 10 years, built a life around staying grounded, played it safe because taking risks was how you lost people. Until yesterday. Until a woman who turned out to be Diana Westfield had screamed at him to leave her, and he decided that some promises needed breaking more than keeping. Marcus walked outside into snow that crunched under his boots, retraced his steps to the crash site. The wreckage was still there, half buried in ice, a monument to failure that the search team had stripped of bodies but left otherwise untouched. He knelt in the snow, pulled aside twisted metal that was cold enough to burn bare skin, and found what he was looking for. A charged circuit board, blackened but intact enough to read. The Westfield Aviation logo stamped into the corner like a signature. Marcus turned it over in his hands, his breath coming in short bursts that had nothing to do with altitude. It was the same system, the same flaw, the same design that had killed Claire, now updated with newer components, but built on the same broken foundation. He tucked the board into his jacket and walked back to the cabin. Inside, Emma was watching cartoons, the news cycle having moved on to other tragedies. Marcus sat beside her, put his arm around her small shoulders, and whispered words she didn't understand but would remember later. History doesn't get to repeat itself, not this time. He looked at the circuit board again, metal cold in his hands that had finally stopped shaking. Claire's face flashed in his mind, her smile on their wedding day, her laugh when Emma said something accidentally hilarious, the way she'd kissed him goodbye the last morning he'd seen her alive. And now this woman, Diana Westfield, daughter of the man who'd killed his wife through negligence disguised as business decisions. He'd saved her, pulled her from fire and explosion and certain death. That made him either a fool or a saint, and Marcus didn't feel like either. He felt like someone who'd been given a chance he didn't ask for and wasn't sure he wanted. A chance to do what, exactly? Make things right, get revenge, find closure in a situation where closure was a myth. People told themselves to feel better about randomness. That night, he pulled out an old file box from under his bed, the kind of box that should have been thrown away years ago, but had become a shrine to obsession instead. Inside were newspaper clippings about the crash accident reports he'd obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and sheer persistence correspondence with lawyers who'd eventually stop returning his calls. He hadn't looked at these in years, had told himself. He was moving forward, letting go, being the stable parent Emma deserved. But he hadn't thrown them away either. And now, spreading them across his kitchen table while Emma slept upstairs, Marcus knew why. Some part of him had been waiting for this. For proof that he'd been right, that the danger wasn't past tense, that saving one more person from Westfield's legacy might matter in some cosmic balance sheet he didn't actually believe in, but couldn't stop hoping existed. 3 days later, Diana Westfield returned. She arrived at the Pine Ridge Control Tower in the early afternoon, dressed in a gray coat and dark jeans, her face still bruised yellow and purple stitches above her eyebrow, held together with careful precision. She asked for Marcus Reed at the front desk, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made receptionists hurry even when they weren't sure why. The receptionist called him down. When Marcus stepped into the lobby, Diana stood with the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime being watched and judged. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lobby continued around them, other people checking in for shifts, deliveries being signed, for the ambient noise of a workplace that didn't care about personal drama. "I wanted to thank you for what you did." Diana's voice was quieter than he'd expected, missing the boardroom confidence from the news footage. Marcus nodded once. "You're welcome. I don't even know your name." "Marcus." She extended her hand. He shook it, his grip firm, but brief, releasing before the contact could mean anything. Diana studied him with eyes that were sharp despite the bruising around them. Eyes that probably didn't miss much during board meetings or contract negotiations or whatever CEOs did when they weren't crashing helicopters in snowstorms. "You've flown before, haven't you?" "I can tell." Marcus's jaw tightened hard enough to make his teeth ache. "Once." "Why'd you stop?" The question hung between them like smoke. Marcus looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who genuinely wanted to know, who thought maybe understanding would mean something. But understanding was the last thing he wanted to give her right now. "Because I had to." Diana nodded, like that answer told her more than the words contained. She reached into her purse, pulled out a business card embossed with the Westfield Aviation logo in silver foil, and placed it in his hand with the care of someone handing over something fragile. "If you ever need work, call me. I owe you more than I can repay." Marcus took the card, stared at it for longer than socially appropriate. The logo seemed to pulse in his vision, or maybe that was just his blood pressure spiking. When he looked up, Diana was already turning toward the door. "Miss Westfield." She turned back, one hand on the door handle. "Why were you flying that day?" Diana's expression flickered, pride, sadness, determination, cycling through too fast to separate. "Because someone has to believe in what we build." She left before he could respond. Marcus watched her walk across the parking lot to a black SUV that probably cost more than his annual salary, watched the vehicle disappear down the mountain road, then looked down at the card in his hand. The Westfield Aviation logo stared back at him. Accusatory, innocent, just a design until you knew what it represented, what it had cost in lives spent for quarterly earnings. On his desk upstairs, the photograph of Claire smiled at him across 10 years of distance. His hands were shaking again, harder now. He wanted to tear the card in half, wanted to throw it away, wanted to call Diana back and tell her everything about Claire, about the cover-up, about the man her father really was behind the public relations campaigns. But he did none of those things. He slipped the card into his pocket and went back to work monitoring flights across screens that reduced human lives to blinking dots and coordinate data. Professional, distant, safe. That night, sleep was optional. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the circuit board from the crash in front of him, and thought about Diana's words. Someone has to believe in what we build. But what if what they built was broken from the start? What if belief without truth was just marketing with extra steps? He thought about calling her, about warning her that the helicopter she'd flown had been doomed before it left the ground. But would she believe him? Would she listen? Or would she do what her father had done, protect the company, protect the legacy, silence the inconvenient truth with legal teams and settlements and non-disclosure agreements? At midnight, he made his decision. He would find proof, undeniable proof, that even Westfield's lawyers couldn't bury. And then he'd give Diana a choice to be like her father or to be better. To choose people over profits, truth over legacy, justice over the comfortable lie that let her sleep at night. He pulled on his jacket, checked on Emma one more time, and drove back to the crash site. The moon was full, casting silver light over snow that had gone from fresh to frozen. Marcus climbed through wreckage that was already becoming part of the landscape, searching with hands that knew what they were looking for. The black box, buried under ice, half melted and covered in frost but intact enough to matter. It took him an hour to pry it loose, metal fused by heat and cold into something that didn't want to be moved. But Marcus worked methodically, carefully, using tools he'd brought and patience he'd learned from 10 years of studying failures. When it finally came free, he carried it to his truck like it was something holy. Back at the cabin, he connected it to his laptop and began extracting data. The files were corrupted sectors lost to fire and impact, but enough survived. Flight logs, navigation telemetry, error codes that cascaded into catastrophic failure. He cross-referenced everything with the records from Claire's crash, spreading documents across his kitchen table in patterns only he could understand. The navigation error was identical, not similar. Identical. The same malfunction, the same ignored warning signals, the same progression from minor glitch to total system failure. And at the bottom of the safety report, stamped in digital signature that authenticated like a confession, was Jonathan Westfield's approval. Signed off despite engineering concerns. Cleared for production despite known risks. Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of certainty pressing down like atmosphere. If he released this, Westfield Aviation would collapse. Diana would lose everything: the company, the legacy, the empire her father had built on foundations that cracked under examination. But if he stayed silent, more people would die. More families would get the call that changed everything. More wives, more daughters, more people who mattered to someone would become statistics in reports marked acceptable risk. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He could send this to the FAA right now. The media, every aviation safety board that would listen. End it. Make them pay. But something stopped him. Diana's face when she'd asked why he'd stopped flying. The genuine gratitude in her voice when she thanked him. The fact that she didn't know, couldn't have known. She'd been 22 when Claire died, probably still in college, building dreams that didn't include blood on her father's hands. His phone buzzed, unknown number. Marcus answered it without thinking, habit from being on call for Emma's school. A distorted voice spoke, mechanical and careful. "Don't open that box, Mr. Reed. Not if you want your daughter to stay safe." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He looked at the phone, then at Lily's Emma's door upstairs. His blood ran cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with understanding exactly what he was dealing with. Not just corporate negligence, not just cover-up, but active, ongoing protection of secrets worth killing for. He walked to Emma's door, pushed it open quietly, watched her breathe in the rhythm of innocent sleep. She was curled up under her star blanket, clutching a stuffed bear that had been with her since she was 2, completely unaware that her father had just been threatened by people who thought children were acceptable collateral damage. Marcus closed the door, walked back to the kitchen, looked at the black box sitting on his table, its secrets exposed but not yet shared. He could destroy it right now, pretend he'd never found it, keep Emma safe by keeping silent the way he'd been silent for 10 years, while the knowledge of Claire's death ate at him from the inside. Or he could do what Claire would have wanted. What was right, even if right meant dangerous. Even if right meant putting himself and Emma at risk for people he'd never meet, for future crashes that hadn't happened yet, but would inevitably mathematically if nothing changed. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Diana Westfield. The number was on the business card she'd given him, embossed in silver that caught the kitchen light. "We need to talk tomorrow, your office." He hit send before he could change his mind. Then he sat down at the table, his head in his hands, and waited for morning. Outside, wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, fresh flakes covering the old erasing tracks, making the world look clean when it was anything but. Marcus went to the window and scanned the tree line. Nothing, just darkness and falling snow, and the feeling that someone was watching from distance in shadow. He double-checked every lock, looked in on Emma again, watched her sleep for 5 minutes to reassure himself she was real and safe and still his. Then he sat in the living room with the circuit board in his lap and didn't sleep. By dawn, he'd made copies of everything: the flight logs, the safety reports, the black box data. Stored them in 3 different locations. One at the cabin, one at the control tower, one with a lawyer in Seattle who owed him a favor from years ago. If something happened to him, the truth would still come out. That was the theory anyway. Marcus wasn't sure he believed in insurance policies against people who made threats in distorted voices, but he believed in trying. He kissed Emma goodbye, told her he'd be back by dinner, and drove to Seattle with evidence that could destroy an empire riding shotgun in a waterproof bag. Marcus walked into Westfield Aviation headquarters at noon, a glass tower in downtown Seattle that existed to prove money could buy height and prestige, but not necessarily integrity. He rode the elevator to the top floor, watching numbers climb while his pulse did the same. The receptionist tried to stop him with polite corporate language about appointments and schedules, but Marcus walked past her like she was furniture. Diana's office was all glass and steel overlooking the city in a way that suggested success was measured in elevation. She looked up from her desk, startled by his entrance, her hand moving toward the phone before recognition stopped her. Marcus? He didn't sit. He pulled the circuit board from his jacket and dropped it on her desk. The charred metal landed with a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have. Diana stared at the scorched component, confusion and concern mixing in her expression. What is it? Marcus's voice came out steadier than he felt. Proof that your father's helicopters killed my wife. The office went silent. Even the city noise from below seemed to pause, waiting. Diana's face went from confused to pale color, draining like someone had opened a valve. 10 years ago, a Westfield Dynamics helicopter went down. Navigation failure. My wife was on board. Marcus leaned forward, hands flat on her desk. Your father signed off on the safety report, even though he knew the system was flawed. Diana's voice was barely audible. That's not possible. It's in the records, and it's happening again. He pointed to the circuit board, his finger steady despite the tremor running through his chest. Same flaw, same system. Your X9 wasn't sabotaged, it was built broken. Diana picked up the board, her fingers shaking enough to make the metal rattle against her rings. She opened her laptop, pulled up engineering files with the quick movements of someone who knew exactly where to look. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by keyboard clicks and the sound of her breathing getting shorter. The office felt smaller with each file she opened. Marcus watched her face tighten with every line she read, watched certainty replace denial in real time. Finally, she looked up with tears streaming down her face in tracks that ruined expensive makeup. Oh my God. Marcus said nothing, just stood there watching her world crack open the way his had 10 years ago, watching her understand that heroes could be villains and legacies could be lies. Diana gripped the edge of her desk hard enough to make her knuckles white. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Your father did. He's dead. Marcus's jaw clenched, but his mistakes aren't. She looked at him with eyes that begged for something understanding, forgiveness, a way out of this conversation that didn't end with everything she believed turning to ash. What do you want me to do? Marcus leaned forward until their faces were close enough for her to see every line of grief etched into his features. You reopen the investigation. You pull every helicopter with that system, and you tell the truth. Diana wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara into war paint. If I do that, this company dies. If you don't, more people do. She nodded slowly, understanding, settling over her like weight. Then she sat down, hands shaking as she began typing. Emails to the FAA, to the NTSB, to every regulatory body that might listen, or might not, but deserve the chance. Marcus watched her type, his chest tight with something that might have been vindication, or might have been grief finally finding an exit. Why are you doing this? The question came out quiet, almost lost in the sound of traffic below. Diana looked up, tears still on her face. Because you were right. Someone has to believe. But belief without truth is just a lie. Before either could speak again, an alarm blared from Marcus's phone. He looked at the screen, his stomach dropping. A distress signal, a pilot missing in the northern ridge, the same area where Diana had crashed. Another X9. Diana checked her tablet, her face draining of remaining color. Test flight, solo pilot. He took off an hour ago. Marcus looked at her with the kind of certainty that came from having seen this movie before. We have to go. Diana nodded. I know. They ran to the elevator together, jabbed buttons that didn't make it move faster, descended in silence that felt like freefall. In the car, neither spoke. Marcus gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt, while Diana stared out the window, her reflection ghost pale in the glass. When they reached the airfield, chaos had already set in. Engineers shouted into radios that returned only static tablets, displayed maps with blinking dots that meant someone's life reduced to GPS coordinates. The storm was building again, darker and faster than weather models had predicted, because nature didn't care about forecasts or corporate timelines. Diana ran to the gathered pilots, her CEO voice cutting through panic. "I need a rescue team, now." The senior pilot, a man named Chen with gray hair and 40 years of experience, shook his head. "That storm's suicide, Miss Westfield. No one's getting through that." Diana looked around at faces that all wore the same expression, sympathy mixed with self-preservation, the calculation every pilot made between heroism and going home to family. "I'll pay anything, double rates, triple." Another pilot crossed his arms, his voice gentle but firm. "Money doesn't spend if you're dead. I've got a wife and kids." That pilot knew the risks when he signed up. Marcus stood by his truck, staring at mountains that were disappearing into clouds the color of bruises. Emma's voice echoed in his head from that morning when he'd called to say goodbye. "You'll pick me up, right? Always." But always was a promise that required him coming back, and the storm building over those peaks looked like the kind that broke promises for sport. He pulled out his phone and called her now. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with 8-year-old optimism. "Dad, hey, sweetheart, I need to tell you something." "Are you okay?" Marcus closed his eyes. "I'm fine, but I have to go fly." Silence on the line long enough that he checked to make sure they hadn't been disconnected. Then Emma's voice came back smaller but steady. "Like you used to, Yeah, like I used to." "Is it dangerous?" Marcus thought about lying. He'd never lied to Emma, not once, not about anything that mattered. The truth was, a gift he'd promised Claire he'd always give their daughter. "A little." "Then why are you going?" He looked at the mountains, then at Diana standing by the hangar with her face pale and her phone pressed to her ear, trying to find someone, anyone willing to fly. "Because it's the right thing to do." Emma's voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "Then do it, Dad. Do the right thing." The line went dead. Marcus stood there with the phone still pressed to his ear, feeling tears he hadn't cried in years burning behind his eyes. Then he walked to the hangar where Diana was still pleading with pilots who'd already made their decisions. "You don't have to do this." Her voice carried desperation wrapped in hope she didn't quite believe in. Marcus looked at her directly. "Yeah, I do." "Then I'm coming with you." He stared at her like she'd suggested they fly to the moon. "That's insane." Diana stepped closer, her chin up, despite the fear in her eyes. "You saved my life. If I'm going to live with that, I need to earn it." She climbed into the co-pilot seat before he could argue further. Marcus stared at her through the cockpit window, saw determination mixed with terror, saw someone choosing to face the thing that had almost killed her instead of running from it. He understood that better than he wanted to admit. The X-9 rescue variant was newer than anything Marcus had flown, all updated systems and modern interfaces that promised reliability no helicopter could actually deliver. The engineering team gave them an emergency beacon and updated coordinates and wishes for good luck that sounded more like eulogies. Tom Chen approached as Marcus was doing pre-flight checks, his face lined with a concern that went beyond professional. "X-9's navigation is solid. We fixed the issues after the crash. But the storm..." Marcus cut him off. "I've flown worse." Tom shook his head. "No, you haven't. None of us have." Maybe he was right. Maybe this was the flight that proved Marcus's luck had finally run out, that you could only cheat death so many times before it stopped being the sport and started being collection. But a man named Jake Martinez was up there somewhere, his helicopter broken, his chances shrinking with every minute of storm that built between him and rescue. The rotors spun up with a sound Marcus had spent 10 years trying to forget, and 3 minutes remembering why it had once felt like freedom. The helicopter lifted into darkening sky while engineers watched from the ground with expressions that suggested they were witnessing either heroism or stupidity and couldn't quite tell the difference. Seattle disappeared below clouds. The flight to Northern Cascades would take 40 minutes if weather cooperated, and forever if it didn't. Marcus's hands on the controls remembered movements he'd thought were lost, muscle memory returning, along with the fear he'd buried under a decade of staying grounded. Diana noticed his hands shaking, the tremor small but visible. "You okay?" Marcus kept his eyes forward. No, but I'm doing it anyway. They flew in silence for minutes that felt elastic, stretched by tension and compressed by adrenaline. The city gave way to forest, gave way to mountains that looked beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Diana watched instruments with the focus of someone who understood that numbers were the only truth when visibility was a suggestion. I'm glad you're here. The words came out of Diana before she could stop them. Marcus glanced at her. Even though I hate everything your father built, especially because of that, you're the only person who will tell me the truth. Silence settled between them, comfortable despite circumstances. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some wall he'd built starting to crack. For what it's worth, you're nothing like him. Diana's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being seen. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in months. The storm hit them like a physical thing, wind slamming the helicopter sideways hard enough to make instruments scream protest. Marcus fought controls that wanted to do anything except what he needed, his whole body engaged in the kind of flying that separated pilots from passengers. ICs formed on the windshield faster than defrost could manage, turning visibility from poor to theoretical. Diana read instruments with a voice that stayed level through effort. Visibility 0, we're flying blind. Marcus's hands moved across controls with the certainty of someone who'd done this in conditions where blind was optimistic. Not blind, instruments show. A warning alarm cut him off, the kind that meant systems were failing in ways backup protocols weren't designed to handle. The navigation display flickered, showed corrupted data went dark. Diana's voice cracked. No, 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 Tom said this was fixed. Marcus didn't waste time on recrimination. Switch to manual, I'll fly by feel. He'd done it before, flown helicopters through weather that turned instruments into liars and navigation into prayer. But that was 10 years and a lifetime ago, back when his hands didn't shake, and his daughter wasn't waiting for him to come home, and his wife was still alive to remind him that heroes and fools look the same from certain angles. Following coordinates that existed more in memory than display, Marcus pushed the helicopter deeper into mountains that wanted them gone. Diana spotted the wreckage first, her voice sharp with relief and new fear. They're 2 o'clock. The crashed helicopter sat in a narrow canyon like a broken toy, rotors shattered into abstract art. The pilot, visible outside the aircraft, slumped against rock. Blood-stained snow around him in patterns that told stories Marcus didn't need medical training to interpret. I'm bringing us down. Wind shear hit them sideways, nearly flipping the helicopter into a roll that would have ended everything. Marcus compensated with movements that came from instinct older than thought, brought them stable enough to attempt what every rational part of his brain screamed was impossible. Diana's voice was tight. There's no landing zone. I'll hover. You go down. Diana stared at him like he'd lost his mind, which was fair because maybe he had. But she clipped herself into the rescue harness anyway, hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained for exactly this and never thought she'd actually do it. Marcus looked at her directly. You sure about this? Diana's fear was visible, but her voice was steady. No, do it anyway. She dropped out of the helicopter into wind that immediately tried to kill her. The harness line spun her like a carnival ride designed by sadists, her body swinging in arcs that would have made physics teachers proud and rescue coordinators resign. Marcus fought to keep the helicopter stable, every muscle engaged in the kind of precise control that made flying look easy from the ground and impossible from inside the storm. Diana reached Jake Martinez and found him barely conscious, his leg bent at an angle that meant broken bones and his skin pale with hypothermia. She clipped him into the harness with hands that shook from cold and fear and determination that refused to quit. Then she signaled Marcus. The winch started pulling them up metal cable, groaning under weight it was rated for but didn't enjoy. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit like a Christmas display designed by pessimists. Engine overheating, ice on rotors, critical. Altitude dropping despite Marcus's best efforts to maintain position. The helicopter wasn't built for this. Wasn't designed to hold 3 people in a storm that was testing every engineering specification and finding them optimistic. Marcus watched altitude numbers fall while weight calculations ran through his head, the kind of math that had only one answer, and it wasn't good. We're too heavy. Diana looked up through snow and wind, and fear saw the helicopter tilting, saw Marcus's face through the windshield tight with effort, and understanding. She looked at Jake, Martinez unconscious in her arm, looked at the harness connecting her to the helicopter, looked at the canyon below that promised certain death. Her hands moved to her harness clip. Marcus saw it happen, saw her making the calculation, saw her choosing. "What are you doing?" Diana's voice came through the radio, clear despite wind that tried to steal it. "Save him. I'll wait for backup." "There is no backup. Storm's getting worse." Diana's face was pale but determined, her eyes locked on his through distance and snowfall. "Then leave me, Marcus. Leave me." The words hit Marcus like bullets, each one finding old wounds and tearing them open fresh. "Leave me." The same words Diana had screamed in the burning helicopter. The same sentiment Claire's last transmission had carried before static and silence. The same choice he'd been running from for 10 years, because leaving people behind was what cowards did, and Marcus had promised himself he'd never be that again. Flashbacks came unbidden. Claire's voice from 10 years ago crackling through radio interference. "Tell Marcus I love," and then nothing, just the sound of systems failing and a helicopter falling, and Marcus arriving too late to do anything except identify remains. Diana, 3 days ago, blood on her face, screaming at him to save himself, while fire consumed metal around her. Emma this morning, 8 years old and trusting, telling him to do the right thing, like doing right was simple when it meant choosing who lived. Marcus looked down at Diana hanging in the wind, at Jake Martinez unconscious and dying at the helicopter that was failing under weight and weather, in the accumulated sins of Westfield Aviation's corner cutting. Every rational part of his brain said release, Diana, save Jake, survive, to go home to Emma, who needed her father more than the world needed another dead hero. But Marcus had spent 10 years being rational. 10 years staying grounded and playing safe and letting fear make his decisions. 10 years telling himself that walking away from flying was about protecting Emma, when really it was about protecting himself from ever feeling lost that deep again. He made his choice. Marcus locked the controls on auto hover, clipped himself into a secondary safety line, and dropped out of the helicopter beside Diana in wind that screamed objection. Diana's voice was pure panic. "What are you doing?" Marcus grabbed her with one arm, grabbed Jake with the other, pulled them both against his chest. "Not leaving you. Not again. Not ever again," he signaled the winch. The cable pulled them up with the sound of metal protesting physics. The helicopter groaned under triple weight rotors, grinding ice engine choking on air too cold and thin to properly combust. They rose inch by agonizing inch canyon walls, rushing past close enough to touch ice, breaking free from rotors in chunks that fell like frozen rain. The helicopter spun, caught in wind shear that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus held Diana and Jake against him, felt the cable jerk and sway, watched the world rotate in ways that made up and down meaningless concepts. They cleared the canyon rim through luck and physics that decided to cooperate for reasons that had nothing to do with deserving. Then the storm hit with everything it had been holding back: wind and snow and ice, combining into weather that existed to prove humans were temporary. The helicopter lost the fight with grace, spinning out of control, while Marcus and Diana and Jake pulled themselves inside through centrifugal force and desperation. Marcus grabbed controls that didn't want to respond, his voice cutting through chaos. "Brace for impact." The helicopter slammed into a snowbank with force that turned the world into noise and pain, and the sudden stop that came from meeting Earth at speeds evolution hadn't prepared bodies to handle. Metal shrieked, glass shattered. Everything that could break did, including several of Marcus's ribs and his certainty that this had been a good idea. Then silence, absolute and ringing, broken only by wind that had moved on to other victims. Search and rescue found them at dawn, guided by emergency beacons that had survived impact better than the people they were designed to protect. Jake Martinez was alive, unconscious, but breathing, his broken legs splinted with pieces of the helicopter that had tried to kill him. They loaded him onto a stretcher with the efficient urgency of people who knew minutes mattered. Diana had a broken wrist and a gash across her forehead that would need stitches, blood matting her hair in patterns that would take days to wash out. But she was conscious, alert, already trying to stand despite paramedics who had opinions about that. Marcus was unresponsive. His hands still gripped the safety line that had kept all three of them tethered to life, his breathing shallow, his face pale under bruises that were starting to bloom. They airlifted him to Seattle General with Emma's name listed as emergency contact and a prognosis that used words like critical and uncertain. Emma sat by his bedside for 8 days holding his hand, whispering stories about school and friends, and the model helicopter she was building in the garage from a kit she'd found in his workshop. She told him about her day, about math tests and lunch period, and how Mrs. Chen said he'd be fine, but Emma could tell adults lied when they thought it would help. She told him she loved him. She told him she was proud of him. She told him that Mom would be proud too, and that one hurt worse than broken ribs because Emma remembered Claire only in fragments and photographs, but loved her anyway with the kind of pure emotion that didn't need memory to justify itself. On the 8th day, Marcus opened his eyes to find Emma asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms, her breathing steady. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper, managed one word that came out as a croak. "Hey." Emma's eyes snapped open, tears immediate and streaming. "Dad." Nurses rushed in, doctors were called, machines beeped in patterns that meant alive instead of dying. Diana hung back by the door, her arm in a sling. Her face bruised but present, watching father and daughter reunite with an expression that mixed relief and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Emma hugged him carefully around tubes and wires and injuries that made breathing an adventure. "You scared me." Marcus's voice was rough from disuse. "I scared myself." She pulled back, studying his face like she was memorizing it in case he disappeared again. "You did the right thing, Dad." Marcus's throat tightened with emotion that had nothing to do with physical damage. He pulled her close, again pressed his face against her hair that smelled like the strawberry shampoo Claire used to buy, felt tears that had been building for 8 days finally find permission to fall. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Diana stepped inside, her movements careful, her presence uncertain. She set a folder on the table beside flowers and get well cards that Emma had been reading to him while he was unconscious. "Can I come in?" Emma nodded before Marcus could speak. Diana walked to the bedside, her good hand clutching the folder like it contained something fragile. "I reopened the investigation. All of it." Marcus stared at her, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Your wife's crashed the X-9 system, every helicopter my father ever signed off on. The FAA is launching a full inquiry. We're grounding every aircraft with that navigation system. Complete recall." Diana's voice stayed steady through effort. "And I'm testifying publicly." Marcus felt something in his chest loosen, some weight he'd been carrying for 10 years, finally finding permission to set down. His eyes filled with tears that blurred Diana into soft edges. "And your name's been cleared. The FAA is reopening Claire's case with full authority." For the first time in a decade, Marcus felt the anger and grief and guilt that had become his constant companions start to lift. Not gone, that kind of loss didn't disappear just because justice showed up late, but lighter, bearable, the kind of weight he could carry without it crushing him. "Thank you." Diana shook her head, her own tears falling. "I should be thanking you. You didn't have to save me. Twice." Marcus looked at Emma, then back at Diana. "Yeah, I did." Diana smiled, but it carried sadness around the edges. "I guess this is goodbye then." She turned to leave, made it 2 steps before Marcus's voice stopped her. "Diana." She looked back, her eyes red from crying and exhaustion, and probably not sleeping much over the past week while he'd been unconscious. Marcus managed something close to a smile despite pain that made facial expressions an adventure. "How many times do you think you owe me your life?" Diana's laugh came out broken. "I stopped counting." 2 months passed in the rhythm of recovery and revelation. Marcus discharged from the hospital with physical therapy appointments and pain medication and strict instructions about not doing anything stupid for at least 6 weeks. Diana's war with the board of directors intensified into something that made business news and required lawyers who specialized in corporate warfare. Robert Crane filed a lawsuit to remove Diana as CEO, claiming she was destroying shareholder value and defaming the company founder with baseless accusations that happened to be supported by evidence. The judge scheduled a hearing that attracted media attention and family members of crash victims who'd been told for years that their loved ones died from pilot error or bad weather or any explanation except corporate negligence. Marcus testified from a wheelchair, his ribs still healing, Emma beside him in her best dress, looking like someone who understood courtroom drama from TV, but not from experience. The plaintiff's lawyer approached with questions designed to discredit, to make Marcus seem unreliable, or motivated by greed, or anything except what he actually was, a man who'd lost his wife to preventable failure. Mr. Reed, you allege Jonathan Westfield knowingly approved defective systems. Marcus's voice carried across the courtroom, clear and certain. I don't allege, I have proof. He presented documents that had been hidden in safety deposit boxes and lawyers' offices and cloud storage accounts designed to survive house fires and threats in time. Original safety reports with Jonathan Westfield's signature approving systems, despite engineering warnings highlighted in red. Email chains discussing acceptable risk and cost-benefit analyses that put price tags on human lives. FAA correspondence showing Westfield Dynamics had lobbied to soften regulations and delay inspections. The courtroom went silent as evidence piled up each document, another nail in the coffin of Westfield's carefully maintained reputation. Diana testified next, her voice steady despite tears that wouldn't stop falling. My father was a brilliant engineer and a terrible man. The words hung in air, thick with witness and judgment. Diana continued each sentence, stripping away another layer of the legacy she'd spent her life defending. He chose profit over people, legacy over lives. I won't make that choice. I'm grounding our entire fleet, initiating full recall of every aircraft with a compromised navigation system. The board's lawyer stood immediately. That will bankrupt the company. Diana looked at him with eyes that had stopped caring about corporate survival. Then we deserve to go bankrupt. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters typed frantically. Family members of crash victims cried with relief or anger or emotions too complex for single words. The judge called for order with a gavel that sounded like punctuation on an era ending. After testimony concluded, an FBI agent approached Diana with the kind of expression that meant bad news delivered with official authority. We've been investigating Westfield Aviation for 3 years. Your testimony just gave us what we needed for indictments. Arrests happened in real time. Robert Crane and Patricia Hayes were escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, their lawyer already on the phone trying to arrange bail. 2 former FAA officials followed their retirement plans, suddenly complicated by federal charges. All of them facing conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, the kind of charges that came with prison time, measured in years instead of months. Diana watched them go with an expression Marcus couldn't read. What about my father? The agent's voice held professional sympathy. Dead men can't stand trial, but his legacy can burn. 6 months passed in the slow time of rebuilding. Westfield Aviation filed Chapter 11, bankruptcy, assets liquidated to pay settlements to families who'd lost people to failures that should have been prevented. Marcus received a check for $2.3 million compensation for Claire's death, calculated by lawyers who specialize in putting price tags on loss. He used the money to fund something new. Phoenix Aviation rose from Westfield's ashes, co-founded by Diana and Marcus, with Tom Chen, and engineers who tried to speak up but been silenced. Built on Marcus's navigation system, designed the one he'd been perfecting in his basement for 10 years, the one that actually worked because it prioritized safety over quarterly earnings. Diana took the CEO position. Marcus became chief safety officer, and Emma appointed herself unofficial mascot who spent weekends at the hangar asking questions that made engineers remember why they'd gone into aviation in the first place. The company motto was painted above the hangar entrance in letters 3 feet high, never again. Emma turned 9, fascinated by engineering in the way of children who'd watched adults build something from conviction instead of profit. Diana taught her about helicopters, about how metal and physics and careful design could create flight. Marcus taught her about ethics, about how technology was only as good as the people building it, about how doing the right thing was sometimes expensive and always worth it. The romantic development between Marcus and Diana happened in the margins of shared work, in late-night design sessions and coffee runs, and the kind of exhaustion that came from building something that mattered. Small moments that added up to something neither of them had been looking for, but both recognized when it arrived. Marcus still wore his wedding ring, a silver band that had weathered 10 years. Diana noticed but never pushed, understood that some things couldn't be rushed. One evening after Emma had gone home with Mrs. Chen, Marcus sat in the hangar office and removed the ring, held it in his palm, feeling the weight of what it represented. Diana found him like that, standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. You don't have to do that for me. Marcus looked at the ring, then at her. I'm not. I'm doing it for me. Claire would want me to live, not just exist. Are you sure? Marcus's smile was sad but genuine. No, but Emma is, and I trust her judgment. 18 months after the first crash, Phoenix Aviation prepared to demonstrate the Guardian Angel navigation system to the world. The name had been Emma's idea, suggested over breakfast one morning, with the casual confidence of someone 9 years old who didn't understand why adults overthought everything. Marcus had loved it immediately for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, something about protection and second chances, and the way his daughter still saw angels where he only saw engineering. The test flight was scheduled for the same mountains where everything had started, where Diana had nearly died and Marcus had remembered how to fly, and Jake Martinez had been pulled from wreckage by two people who'd had no business attempting rescue, but did it anyway. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the FAA officials who'd be watching with clipboards and skepticism and the institutional memory of an agency that had been embarrassed by its own failure to catch Westfield's corruption. Marcus stood in the Phoenix hangar at dawn running pre-flight checks on a helicopter that represented 2 years of work and every lesson learned from studying failures. Diana was beside him reviewing system diagnostics, her movements efficient despite the slight hesitation in her left wrist that remained from the brake. Tom Chen coordinated with the ground crew, his voice carrying the careful authority of someone who'd learned that cutting corners killed people. Emma arrived with Mrs. Chen carrying a backpack and determination. She walked straight to Marcus with the kind of purpose that meant she'd already decided something and prepared arguments for any objection. I want to come. Marcus looked at her, at Diana, back at his daughter, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. Emma, this is a test flight. It's not safe. You said the guardian angel makes it safe. Were you lying? Diana tried not to smile and failed. Marcus recognized the trap his daughter had set and walked into it anyway, because sometimes being a parent meant letting your kids prove you'd raised them right. You'll stay in the passenger section with the safety team. No arguments. Emma grinned, victory achieved. No arguments. Before the flight, they drove to the crash site. The wreckage had been cleared months ago, metal recycled or disposed of according to regulations designed to prevent morbid trophy hunting. What remained was a meadow that spring had reclaimed, wildflowers growing in soil that had been scorched and traumatized and decided to bloom anyway. A memorial plaque had been installed at the site, bronze bolted to granite, that would outlast everyone present. The inscription was simple, in memory of all lives lost to preventable failures. Claire's name was listed along with Jake Martinez's co-pilot, who died in the first crash, and dozens of others from crashes spanning 2 decades. Below the names, a final line: they deserve better. We can do better. Jake Martinez was there with his wife and 2 daughters, his walk still carrying a slight limp, but carrying nonetheless. He'd recovered enough to return to work, though he'd switched from test pilot to flight instructor, teaching the next generation that following procedure mattered more than showing off. When he saw Marcus and Diana, he crossed the meadow to shake hands that gripped with genuine gratitude. You two saved my life. I don't forget that. Marcus shook his head. You would have done the same. Maybe, but you actually did it. Families of other victims were present too, invited by Diana personally, despite her lawyer's advice that engaging with people who might still sue was strategically questionable. An elderly woman named Patricia, whose son had died flying a Westfield medical transport. A middle-aged man named James, whose sister had been a patient being evacuated when navigation failed over the Rockies. 23 people total, each representing a loss that had been dismissed as acceptable risk by accountants who'd never met them. Diana stood before them with vulnerability that corporate training had tried to eliminate and grief had restored. Her voice carried across the meadow without amplification. My father built machines that killed your loved ones. I can't undo that. I can't bring them back. But I can promise that Phoenix Aviation will never put profit over people, that every system we build will be tested beyond failure, that we'll ground entire fleets before we risk one more preventable death. Patricia stepped forward, her eyes wet but her voice steady. Your father made my son's death meaningless. You're trying to make it matter. That's something. The families gathered around the plaque, silent, in the way of people who'd learned that some grief didn't need words. Marcus stood beside Claire's name, his hand touching the bronze letters that were already warming in morning sun. He thought about all the conversations he'd had with her in his head over 10 years, all the ways he'd tried to explain himself to someone who couldn't hear anymore. Emma took his other hand, squeezed it with fingers that were getting stronger every year. Mom would be proud of you. Marcus looked down at his daughter, at the person Claire had been growing inside her when she died, at the 9-year-old who'd somehow survived losing her mother and gained wisdom that most adults never found. You think so? I know so. You did the right thing even when it was hard. That's what heroes do. They walked back to the helicopter together, the three of them. Marcus, Diana, Emma, forming a unit that hadn't existed 18 months ago but felt inevitable now. The families followed at a distance, some filming with phones, others just watching, like they needed to witness that something good could come from loss. The helicopter gleamed in morning light, white and blue, with the Phoenix Aviation logo painted on the tail. Guardian Angel was written along the fuselage in gold letters that caught sun and threw it back. Tom Chen ran final system checks while FAA inspectors watched with expressions that suggested they wanted to be impressed, but had been disappointed too many times to expect it. Marcus climbed into the pilot seat, his hands finding controls that had become familiar again, through hundreds of hours relearning what fear had made him forget. Diana took co-pilot position, her movements practiced enough to look natural. In the passenger section, Emma sat between two safety officers who'd been briefed that if anything went wrong, protecting the CEO's kid was their only job. The rotors spun up with a sound when Marcus associated with freedom and terror in equal measure. He ran through pre-flight checklists with Diana, their voices overlapping in rhythm they'd developed over months of working together. Navigation system, online and stable, backup systems, all green, weather conditions. Diana checked displays that showed real-time data from satellites and ground stations. Clear now. Storm system moving in from the west, but not expected for 6 hours. Marcus looked at the mountains at peaks that had tried to kill him twice and might try again if they got the chance. Then let's see what she can do. The helicopter lifted off smooth as a promise kept rising into blue sky, while cameras recorded every moment for live stream that would prove Phoenix Aviation's technology worked or fail spectacularly in front of everyone who mattered. They flew over Pine Ridge, over the air traffic control station, where Marcus had spent years monitoring other people's flights while his own wings stayed folded. Over the highway where he'd driven Emma to school every morning. Over the forest where Claire's helicopter had gone down 10 years ago, the site marked now with a small cross Emma had insisted on placing. The Guardian Angel navigation system tracked their position with precision, measured in inches, displayed data on screens that updated faster than human reaction time, ran self-diagnostics that would alert to problems before they became failures. Everything Westfield's system should have been if corporate priorities had valued lives over stock prices. They reached the ridge where Diana's X9 had crashed. Marcus brought the helicopter into a hover-holding position while wind tested their stability. The system compensated automatically, making micro-adjustments that kept them steady despite conditions that would have had older helicopters fighting for control. Emma's voice came through the headset from the passenger section. "This is amazing, Dad." Marcus smiled despite nervousness that lived in his chest like a permanent resident. "Pretty cool, right?" They flew the planned route, following waypoints that took them over every location where Westfield aircraft had crashed in the past 20 years. A memorial tour that nobody had asked for but felt necessary anyway, a way of acknowledging that progress was built on failures, and the people who'd paid for those failures deserved recognition. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, darkened building with the kind of aggressive growth that meant weather was about to have opinions. Marcus watched them approach calculated arrival time, compared it to their flight plan. They had time. Probably. Diana noticed his attention shift. "We should head back." Marcus looked at the clouds, looked at the navigation display showing green across every system, looked at his daughter in the passenger section, trusting that her father knew what he was doing. Old Marcus would have turned back immediately, played it safe, chosen caution over confidence. New Marcus, or maybe original Marcus, finally remembered, made a different choice. "Let's see what the Guardian Angel can do in weather." Diana's eyebrows raised. "You sure?" Marcus glanced back at Emma, who was watching him with complete faith that bordered on terrifying. "I'm sure. I trust this machine. I trust you. I trust us." They flew toward the storm instead of away from it, entering clouds that turned the world gray and reduced visibility to distances measured in hope. Rain hit the windshield in sheets, wind shoved them sideways. Turbulence made smooth flight a memory from 5 minutes ago. The kind of conditions that had killed Claire, that had nearly killed Diana, that had sent Jake Martinez into a canyon to die slowly from hypothermia and broken bones. But the guardian angel held steady. Navigation stayed locked position. Data accurate system diagnostics showing green, while weather did everything possible to prove technology was just hubris with math. Marcus flew with the confidence of someone who'd helped design every component, who understood the engineering not just as concepts, but as solutions to specific failures he'd witnessed. They broke through the other side of the storm into clear air, and sunshine the mountain valley spread below them like a postcard. Emma cheered from the passenger section loud enough to make the safety officers smile. Diana exhaled slowly, tension releasing from shoulders that had been carrying it since they'd entered the clouds. Marcus brought them down on the landing pad at Pine Ridge Airfield, where crowds had gathered despite the early hour. FAA officials, journalists, families of victims, aviation enthusiasts who'd been following Phoenix Aviation's development online. They touched down gentle enough that champagne glasses wouldn't have spilled if anyone had been drinking champagne at 7 in the morning. Applause erupted as the rotors wound down. Emma unbuckled and ran to Marcus before the safety officers could stop her, threw her arms around him with the kind of hug that made broken ribs and hard landings worth it. Diana stood beside them, her face wet with tears that were probably relief but might have been something more. Tom Chen approached with a tablet showing system data from the flight. Everything performed perfectly. Navigation stayed accurate to within 3 inches throughout. The FAA observers are impressed. Marcus looked at Diana, saw pride and exhaustion, and the satisfaction that came from proving cynics wrong. "We did it." Diana shook her head. "You did it. This was your design. Built by your engineers, funded by your company. This is ours." The press conference afterward was standard corporate theater. Diana at a podium, Phoenix Aviation logo behind her, prepared remarks about safety and innovation and commitment to excellence. But her voice carried genuine emotion when she talked about the families affected by her father's decisions, about the responsibility that came with building machines that carried human lives. "This isn't just a helicopter. It's a promise that we will never put profit over people again, that we will honor those we've lost by doing better, by being better." She gestured to where Marcus stood with Emma, to where Jake Martinez sat with his family, to where the families of crash victims watched with expressions that ranged from hopeful to skeptical. "My father made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I won't compound them by staying silent. Phoenix Aviation exists to make sure his failures don't become our future." Questions came rapid fire from reporters who smelled story in the intersection of redemption and corporate responsibility. Diana handled them with the poise of someone who'd been trained for this, but the honesty of someone who'd learned that truth was harder, but better than spin. After the conference, Diana found Marcus and Emma outside the hangar, standing by the edge of the airfield, watching sunset paint the mountains gold. She approached with the careful body language of someone about to suggest something that might get rejected. "Want to see the view from the top?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The top of what?" "The mountain, where it all started." They hiked together, 3 people who'd been strangers 18 months ago and felt like family now. Emma ran ahead, chasing butterflies that were too fast and too smart to be caught, her laughter carrying back on wind that was gentle for once. Marcus and Diana walked side by side, not quite touching, but close enough that the space between them felt deliberate. The meadow where Diana's helicopter had crashed was transformed by summer. The scorched earth had given way to wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush, and mountain daisies, creating color patterns that would have seemed designed, except nature didn't need designers. Emma ran through the flowers, her joy uncontained by circumstances that would have made adults somber. Marcus stood at the spot where he'd pulled Diana from burning wreckage, where he'd made the choice to run toward danger instead of away, where everything had changed in the time it took for a fuel tank to ignite. The memory was visceral, the heat, the smoke, the weight of Diana's body as he'd carried her to safety. Diana stepped beside him, her presence solid. "I used to think this place was cursed." Marcus looked out over the valley that spread below them in shades of green and gold. "And now I think it's where I learned to stop running." Diana reached into her pocket and pulled out a small box, her hands shaking enough to make the movement uncertain. She opened it to reveal a silver ring, simple in design, but weighted with intention. Engraved on the inside were two words, "Never leave." She held it out to him, her voice carrying across the meadow to where Emma had stopped running and was watching with barely contained excitement. "Marcus Reed, I told you to leave me once. Worst words I ever said. I'm asking you to stay now, for good. Forever." Emma bounced on her toes, her whisper loud enough to hear from 20 feet away. "Say yes, Dad." Marcus looked at the ring, at Diana, at his daughter, who'd somehow known this was coming, and approved enthusiastically. He thought about Claire, about the years of grief and anger and bitterness that had consumed him after her death. Thought about the walls he'd built to protect himself from ever feeling lost that deep again, about how Diana had somehow gotten past every defense through persistence and honesty and the kind of moral courage that made him believe people could choose to be better than their inheritance. "You sure about this?" Broken pilot, PTSD stubborn, comes with opinionated 9-year-old. Diana's smile was soft but certain. "I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything." Marcus took the ring, felt the weight of silver and commitment and second chances earned through hard choices. He thought about Claire one more time, heard her voice in memory, telling him that love wasn't a betrayal of what they'd had, but an extension of it, that she'd want him to find happiness again, even if happiness looked different than what they'd planned. Then yes, yes. Emma ran over and threw her arms around both of them, creating a collision of joy and tears and laughter that echoed across the meadow. Diana slipped the ring onto Marcus's finger beside the tan line where his wedding band had lived for 10 years. He looked at it, new metal catching sunlight, promise made in a meadow where death had been transformed into life. They sat together watching the sun sink toward mountains that had witnessed everything, Emma between them, holding both their hands. The sky turned colors that didn't have names, the kind of sunset that made atheists reconsider and believers feel smug. Wind carried the scent of wildflowers and pine, and the particular quality of mountain air that made breathing feel like medicine. Diana leaned against Marcus, her head on his shoulder. "What happens now?" Marcus looked at Emma, at the ring on his finger, at the woman who'd chosen truth over legacy and paid for that choice with everything except her integrity. "Now we live. We build things that matter. We teach Emma that doing right is more important than looking good." Emma squeezed both their hands. "And we fly. Don't forget flying." Marcus smiled. "Right, and we fly." They stayed until stars began appearing, small lights that grew brighter as the sky darkened. Emma identified constellations she'd learned from a book Marcus had bought her, pointing out Orion and Cassiopeia and making up names for patterns that weren't officially recognized by astronomers, but looked real enough from their perspective. The hike back down happened in comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's questions about why flowers closed at night and whether butterflies dreamed and if helicopters ever got tired of flying. Marcus answered what he could and admitted ignorance, on the rest teaching her that saying "I don't know" was better than making up answers that sounded good but weren't true. At the base of the mountain, Mrs. Chen was waiting with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been expecting this outcome and approved. Emma ran to her, already talking about the proposal and the ring and how she was getting a mom, which was different than getting her mom back, but still good in its own way. Marcus and Diana walked to the truck hand in hand, neither speaking because some moments didn't need words to be complete. The drive back to Pine Ridge happened in darkness, punctuated by headlights and occasional towns that appeared like promises of civilization between stretches of forest. Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her head against the window, her breathing the kind of steady that only children managed. 2 years after the first crash, Phoenix Aviation had become more than a company. It was a statement about what happened when people chose integrity over profit, about how failure could become foundation if you learn the right lessons. The hangar had expanded to include a training facility that offered free courses to aspiring pilots and engineers, teaching the next generation that safety wasn't optional and corners weren't meant for cutting. Marcus flew regularly now, the fear that had grounded him for a decade replaced by confidence earned through understanding. He led rescue missions as a volunteer, saved 47 lives in 2 years through a combination of skill and technology and the kind of stubbornness that refused to leave people behind. Emma flew with him, sometimes sitting co-pilot and learning to read instruments and understanding that her father had been broken once, but chose to repair himself through action. Diana testified before Congress about aviation safety reform, her words carrying weight because she'd sacrificed her family's company to tell truth that powerful people wanted buried. New regulations passed mandatory third-party audits, anonymous reporting systems for engineers who witnessed safety violations, criminal liability for executives who prioritize profits over people. Changes that wouldn't bring back the dead, but might prevent the next tragedy. She donated her entire personal fortune to victims' families, money that had come from Westfield aviation profits built on acceptable risk and calculated negligence. Lived modestly now in a house that was smaller than her previous office, but felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived before. Worked harder than she'd ever worked as CEO because building something that mattered was more exhausting and more satisfying than maintaining something built on lies. On the anniversary of Claire's death, they visited her grave together, Marcus Diana, who was Diana Reed now, and Emma, who'd gained a mother without losing the memory of the one she'd started with. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Pine Ridge, peaceful in the way of places dedicated to remembering. Emma brought flowers she'd picked from the meadow where the crash had happened, wildflowers that hadn't been arranged or purchased, but felt more honest because of it. She placed them at the headstone with careful reverence, then stepped back to stand between her fathers, between the man who'd raised her and the woman who'd chosen to join that raising. Diana knelt by the grave, her hand touching the stone with gentleness that made Marcus's chest tight. Thank you, Claire, for raising a good man, for Emma, for leading us to each other. Marcus stood with his arm around his daughter, watching his wife honor his first wife with grace that made love look like multiplication instead of division. Emma leaned against him warm and alive, in the best parts of Claire walking around in the world. Mom, do you think Mommy Claire watches us? Diana looked up at Emma with eyes that were wet but clear. I do, sweetheart, and I think she's proud. Marcus knotted his throat too tight for words. He thought about Claire every day still, but the grief had transformed from sharp agony to gentle ache from wound to scar that reminded him he'd survived something that tried to destroy him. They walked back to the car together, Emma between them, holding both their hands, creating a chain of connection that felt stronger than the sum of its parts. A Phoenix helicopter flew overhead, guardian angel painted on the side, probably Tom Chen running maintenance checks, or a trainee learning emergency procedures. Emma pointed at it with the kind of pride that came from knowing she'd helped name something important. That's ours. Marcus looked at the helicopter, at his daughter, at his wife. That's ours. Diana squeezed his hand. That's everyone's. That's the point. They drove away from the cemetery as evening settled over Pine Ridge, the town lit with streetlights that marked civilization in darkness. Emma fell asleep in the back seat again, exhausted from emotion and hiking, and the particular tiredness that came from days that mattered. Marcus drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand holding Diana's, the ring on his finger catching dashboard light. He thought about the journey from that first crash to this moment, the anger and grief, and slowly learning that healing didn't mean forgetting, but meant choosing to live anyway. Thought about how saving Diana had somehow saved himself, how doing the right thing had been terrifying and expensive and worth every cost. At home, they carried Emma to bed without waking her, tucked her under star blankets that she'd had since Claire was alive. Marcus stood in the doorway watching his daughter sleep, overwhelmed by love and responsibility, and the particular terror of knowing that everything you cared about could be lost in the time it took for a system to fail. Diana stepped beside him, her arm around his waist. You okay? Marcus nodded, just remembering that nothing's guaranteed, that I could lose everything again. You could. We both could. That's why we have to make it matter while we're here. They went to their own room, climbed into bed in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Marcus stared at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow and the rescue training he was teaching and the design consultation Diana had asked for and the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life dedicated to preventing the failures that had defined his past. Diana's voice came soft in the darkness. Do you think we've done enough? Marcus turned to face her, could barely see her outline in the dim light from the hallway. Enough for what? To make up for everything. All the people who died because of my father's choices. Marcus took her hand, felt the calluses that had formed from working in hangars instead of boardrooms, from choosing to build instead of just manage. We'll never make up for it. That's not how justice works. But we can make sure it doesn't keep happening. That's something. Diana was quiet for a long moment. I still see their faces sometimes. In the court documents, all the people who died flying Westfield aircraft. I know. I see Claire. Does it get easier? Marcus thought about that question about 10 years of grief and 2 years of rebuilding, and the way scar tissue was tougher than original skin, but would never be the same. It gets different. You learn to carry it better. And sometimes on good days you remember that living well is better than living guilty. They fell asleep holding hands, two people who'd been enemies by inheritance and became family by choice, who'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about refusing to repeat it. Morning came with Emma jumping on their bed, already dressed and eager for the day. She'd made breakfast, or attempted to, which meant there were pancakes that were slightly burned and orange juice that had been poured enthusiastically enough to create puddles. They ate together at the kitchen table, Emma talking about school and friends and the science project she was planning about helicopter aerodynamics. Marcus watched his daughter explain lift and thrust with hand gestures borrowed from his own teaching. Watched Diana listen with genuine interest instead of polite patience, and felt something in his chest that might have been contentment. He'd spent 10 years thinking happiness was a betrayal of Claire's memory, that moving forward meant leaving her behind. But Emma was right. You could love more than one person, could build new family without destroying the old, could honor the dead by living fully instead of living carefully. After breakfast, they drove to the Phoenix Aviation hangar together. Sunday mornings were unofficial family time at the company, not required but encouraged, a way of building culture that valued people over productivity. Emma ran to the design lab, where Tom Chen was working on improved rotor efficiency, already asking questions that would take hours to answer properly. Marcus and Diana walked the hangar floor, inspecting helicopters in various stages of maintenance, greeting the engineers and mechanics who'd chosen to come in on their day off because they believed in what they were building. The Guardian Angel navigation system had been licensed to 3 other aviation companies, agreements that included mandatory safety protocols and surprise inspections, and the right to revoke licenses if anyone tried to cut corners Westfield style. They stood together looking at the newest helicopter, a medical transport variant designed specifically for mountain rescue. Emma had named this one Hope, which was on the nose but appropriate given its purpose. The system was scheduled for its first real-world test next week, a partnership with Seattle General to provide emergency transport in conditions where traditional helicopters couldn't safely fly. Diana leaned against Marcus, her head on his shoulder in a gesture that had become habitual. "We did good work." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "We did work that matters. That's better than good." Emma appeared with Tom Chen in tow, both of them excited about something involving computational fluid dynamics that Marcus would need diagrams to fully understand. She grabbed both her parents' hands and pulled them toward the design lab, talking rapidly about innovations and possibilities, and the future she could see clearly because she hadn't learned yet that the world resisted progress. They spent the day together in the hangar, a family built from tragedy and choice, and the stubborn belief that people could be better than their worst moments. Marcus flew a training run with Diana as co-pilot, and Emma in the passenger section taking notes for her science project. They tested emergency protocols, practiced navigation failures that the Guardian Angel caught and corrected before they could become catastrophic, proved again that technology designed with integrity performed better than technology designed with profit margins. As the sun set over Pine Ridge, painting the sky in colors that made believers out of skeptics, they stood together on the tarmac watching the last helicopter of the day land. The pilot, a young woman named Sarah, who'd lost her brother in a Westfield crash, gave them a thumbs up as she powered down. Another successful flight, its other day of proving that never again was a promise they intended to keep. Marcus pulled Diana close with one arm and Emma with the other, creating a circle of 3 that felt complete despite the missing piece that would always be Claire. He thought about how far they'd come from that first crash, from the moment he'd run into fire to save someone who'd become the center of his rebuilt life. Thought about all the choices between then and now, every decision to do right instead of easy, every moment of choosing truth over comfort. Emma looked up at him with Claire's eyes and her own fierce determination. "Dad, when I grow up, I'm going to build helicopters that never crash." Marcus smiled, knowing she'd learned that perfect safety was impossible, but trying for it was noble. "I believe you will, sweetheart." Diana squeezed his hand, the ring on his finger pressing against hers in reminder of promises made and kept. We'll help her. They walked to the car as stars began appearing overhead, small lights that had witnessed everything and would keep witnessing long after they were gone. The Phoenix aviation hangar glowed behind them, windows bright with people still working, despite the hour building things that would carry strangers safely through danger. Marcus started the engine and headed home, his family beside him, his past acknowledged but not controlling him, his future uncertain but chosen deliberately. The road unwound before them in familiar curves, Pine Ridge appearing in the distance like something worth returning to. In the back seat, Emma hummed a song Claire used to sing, melody passed from mother to daughter, through memory and love that death couldn't actually end. Marcus caught Diana's eye and saw her smiling, saw her understanding that this was what healing looked like, not forgetting, not replacing, but expanding to include both grief and joy, both past and present, both who you'd lost and who you'd found. They pulled into the driveway of a house that was modest and warm and filled with the evidence of lives being lived with intention. Inside, they'd have dinner together, and Emma would do homework, and Diana would review design specifications, and Marcus would check weather patterns for tomorrow's flights. Normal things that felt extraordinary because they'd been earned through courage and choice and the refusal to let tragedy become identity. Before going inside, Marcus looked up at stars that were the same stars Claire had seen, the same stars that would shine long after his own story ended. He thought about how lives intersected and diverged, how saving one person had led to saving himself, how love wasn't finite but infinite if you were brave enough to keep opening your heart despite knowing it could break again. Emma took his hand. Dad, you coming? Marcus looked at his daughter, at his wife waiting in the doorway backlit by home. Yeah, sweetheart, I'm coming. They walked inside together into light and warmth, and the ordinary magic of family dinners and bedtime stories and the thousand small moments that made up a life worth living. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, but not the stars, keeping in the love that had been built from ashes and choice, and the stubborn belief that people could change, could heal, could fly again if they were willing to face their fear and do the work. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wildflowers from the mountain meadow, where it all began, where death had been transformed into life, where three people had found each other in the wreckage and chosen to build something better. The Phoenix aviation hangar glowed in the distance, beacon of what was possible when people chose integrity over profit, people over quarterly earnings, truth over comfortable lies. And somewhere in the darkness between earth and stars, Claire Reed smiled, proud of the man her husband had become, grateful for the woman who'd helped him heal in love with the daughter they'd created and the life that daughter was building. Not watching from heaven, because that wasn't how physics worked, but present anyway in the way that love persists beyond death, in the way that good people leave marks on the world that outlast their bodies, in the way that choosing right creates ripples that spread farther than anyone can see. The story didn't end with happily ever after, because stories don't end while people are still living. But it continued with purposefully ever after, with deliberately ever after, with courageously ever after. Marcus Reed flew helicopters and saved lives and taught his daughter that broken things could be repaired, and broken people could heal, and broken systems could be rebuilt if you were willing to do the hard work. Diana Reed led a company that proved profit and integrity weren't opposites, that success could be measured in lives saved instead of stock prices, that legacy was about what you built, not what you inherited. Emma Reed grew up surrounded by people who chose to be better than their circumstances required, who proved that children of tragedy could become architects of hope. And in a meadow on a mountain in Washington state, wildflowers bloomed every spring in colors that seemed designed by someone who understood that beauty could grow from ashes, that life insisted on continuing despite death's best efforts, that the earth healed itself, and so could people if they were patient and persistent and willing to believe that second chances were possible for those brave enough to take them.